At the current moment in time, games have become pretty stagnant, especially those coming out of the AAA sphere. There's a lot of generic churning out of repetitive titles that provide very little in the way of innovation and tend to sit solidly in the same few genres. So it's safe to say that it was a pleasant surprise to hear about the release of Hi-Fi Rush, an action rhythm game that marks itself as a massive departure from what is normal in more ways than one. Firstly, there's the obvious aspect of its unique blend of genres. Action rhythm games are relatively rare and almost unheard of with this sort of budget behind them. This lack of prior standards or expectations is what set the stage for Hi-Fi Rush to make strides in terms of gameplay. On top of being a very innovative project, Hi-Fi Rush is also a very ambitious one, as it's a completely new direction for the studio behind it, Tango Gameworks. Before this, they'd only really made horror games, which share next to no similarities to Hi-Fi Rush. And this is just speculation, but a shift this huge in genres and theming suggests to me at least that Hi-Fi Rush was at its core a passion project that came about as a result of a few people on the team being infatuated with the concept behind the game. And as with most projects that come about from that mindset, we got something really unique and honestly genius at times that has some rough edges. So this video is going to be dissecting the game's mechanics and narrative to pick apart that genius and take a closer look at what went wrong with those rough edges. Hi-Fi Rush takes place in a futuristic world where every aspect of life is some way enhanced by technology. Within this world, there's a massive corporation that's responsible for the rapid development of technology called Vandelay, which at its core is a robotics company. The game starts off with Chai, our main character, entering the building for Vandelay's Armstrong project, in the hopes of having his broken arm replaced with a mechanical one. This goes horribly wrong, however, as through Tom and Jerry-like logic, Chai's iPod ends up on top of him during the process, causing it to be embedded inside of him. This gives Chai strange rhythm powers. I'd love to give an explanation of what they are and how they work, but it's never explained in the game. The most we can assume is that his body is constantly following the rhythm of whatever song is playing on the iPod, and this enhances Chai's physical capabilities as long as he stays on beat. But really it's just a plot device to set up the rest of the story and gameplay. After being labeled as a defect, he's attacked by some of the Vandelay robots, which he dispatches with his newfound abilities. Chai is then approached by a cat who helps him escape the Vandelay facility. The cat leads Chai to its hideout where he meets Peppermint, who is controlling and speaking through the cat. At this point you find out about Vandelay's secret project named Spectra, which supposedly is something sinister, and Peppermint asks you to help her find more information by infiltrating various Vandelay facilities. That's the basic setup for the plot and puts us on the path of figuring out what Spectra is, expanding our team, and attempting to take down Vandelay Robotics. Before I go into more specifics about the story and characters though, I want to discuss the game's mechanics. The gameplay of Hi-Fi Rush can be broken up into two distinct sections, traversal and combat. These two never overlap in the game and are completely independent of each other. Combat only takes place in specified arenas, breaking up larger sections of traversal. So the general format of each level is traversal, combat arena, traversal, combat arena, traversal, combat arena, and then ending with some sort of boss fight. Let's first take a look at the combat mechanics, since they're the core of what makes gameplay so interesting. Everything in combat is done in time to the beat. Even if you don't input in time to the beat, your actions will take place on the beat. Your three main options during combat are a light attack, which takes 1 beat to perform, a heavy attack, which takes 2 beats to perform, and a dodge. By stringing together attacks in succession, you can perform combos which do vastly more damage and give you more score than just regularly attacking. As you progress through the game, you can expand what combos you're able to perform by purchasing them from Peppermint using gears, which are the main currency in the game. Gears can be found scattered around the levels and dropped from enemies when defeated. There's an enormous amount of combo variety in the game, and some of them are really cool. In fact, most of them are really cool. And they can get pretty complex, asking you to string together a variety of light and heavy attacks, or even leave single beat pauses between attacking. Unfortunately though, it really isn't necessary to use all of these flashy combos you have at your disposal, since you can easily get through the whole game just using the basic 4 light attack combo you have at the start. You won't be getting the highest scores, since repeatedly using the same combo makes it worth less points, but you won't be doing noticeably less damage. It's a massive shame to see how underutilized the more advanced combos are, because they're really satisfying to pull off, and I would much rather they were the most efficient way of fighting, since as it stands, using some fancy combo is not the easiest way to overcome most combat encounters. Alongside these options, you also have a special attack that charges up as you collect little batteries from around the levels or from defeating enemies. Special attacks can take many different forms, and similarly to combos can be purchased from Peppermint in exchange exchange for gears. Most of these attacks are just straight up damage, but there are a few that provide unique benefits like healing, defenses, or distractions. This is a really cool idea to give the player options beyond just raw damage, and ended up defining my own playstyle in the later sections of the game, as I chose to go with a healing special that allowed me to play far more aggressively than I was before. Certain special attacks also use characters from your group. Even the cat has a special attack, and it's the strongest and most expensive attack in the entire game, which was kind of funny. As you progress through the game, you'll unlock other mechanics to use in combat, those being the ability to call in a partner, the grappling hook, and the parry. All of these mesh quite well with the established core combat, but have their own unique problems that they bring to the table. Firstly, there's the ability to call in a partner. Every few seconds, you can summon in a member of your team to help you in battle using the right trigger. Each character has their own unique purpose and attack, which will have different effects, and you can unlock special combos that only work when calling in a specific character during an attack. For the most part, this mechanic works really well and does a good job at diversifying your options when approaching combat, but unfortunately it comes with a pretty steep downside. There are certain enemies in the game that you are unable to attack until you get a specific character to take out their defenses, and since you can only call in a character every few seconds, this creates situations where you are just dodging around waiting for the character you need to come off cooldown. This wouldn't be a problem if every enemy's defenses could be taken out in a single blow, but there are many, especially later in the game, that require multiple attacks from a summoned character, extending that time that you're unable to fight for yourself. This really slows the pace of the game and is seriously detrimental to the overall feeling of combat, as just waiting around isn't nearly as engaging as throwing out massive combos. This only happens rarely though, since most encounters have a mix of normal enemies and those with specific defenses, but the times that it does happen stick out like a sore thumb and are a sour note in an otherwise very polished combat system. The grappling hook, however, is as unproblematic as it can possibly be. Its issue is how much untapped potential it has. The grappling hook is only used to pull chai to an enemy in combat. It's quite literally its only use. No special combos involving it, no swinging enemies around, no special attacks using it, just a tool for closing distance. Do I really need to say more? It's obvious that there's so much more that could have been done with a grappling hook that just wasn't. Parrying has a similar problem, but less with untapped potential and more with underutilization. Parrying is implemented in two different ways. You can parry normal enemies in regular combat by just pressing B when an attack is about to hit you, but this is just as effective as dodging, and there are very, very few enemies in the game that are designed to be parried in regular combat. Parrying is much better utilized in these mid-fight one-on-ones. Certain special enemies and specific bosses will pull you out of normal combat and into a one-on-one fight, where they telegraph a string of attacks that follow a rhythm which you have to parry or dodge at the right time. This is amazing, and it's so incredibly satisfying to play this mini rhythm game within the rhythm game, and it gives the opportunity for certain enemies to showcase more personality. It's how parrying should feel in a rhythm game, and it utilizes the concept to its fullest potential. I only wish there were more enemies that force you to parry in regular combat, since it's demonstrated so clearly how well rhythm and parrying mesh during the one-on-one sections. I also wanted to take a moment to mention how well this is all tutorialized. All the tutorials in the game take place on a stage in front of a massive crowd and have really clear explanations of how it all works by using a more traditional rhythm game way of showing when to press what. It's a good way to ease the player into the harder to execute mechanics, and I wanted to spotlight it since tutorials are often bad, and when they aren't bad, they're overlooked. This is all great, but combat in a game lives and dies on decent enemies. This is going to be my hot take for the video. I think there should have been more enemy variety in the game. I don't just mean more enemy types, because there are plenty of enemy types. I mean enemies that aren't just robots. You only fight robots. Unless it's a boss fight, it's just more robots. Granted, the robots do have a lot of variation, there is a good spread of new enemies introduced across the game, and many of them have a lot of personality in their designs and the way they fight, but still, I wish it wasn't just robots. It might just be me that feels this way, but there's something very special about when a natural and organic being is animated to a rhythm. It's why rhythm heaven games are so deeply satisfying to me. It's not just things that move in completely straight lines and at perfectly even speeds, it's organic beings that move in organic ways being timed up to the beat. I don't hate the enemies or bosses in Hi-Fi Rush, in fact they're really well designed, both presentation and gameplay wise. I just see bosses like Rekka and realize what could have been. Overall, the combat in this game is its main selling point. It's utterly brilliant and manages to flow almost effortlessly while completely staying in time with the music. It's a genius way to combine these these two genres and is endlessly cathartically enjoyable. The combo, special attack, and summoning systems, while flawed, provide the player with near endless options and create opportunities for player expression, as you can customize your toolkit to match your preferred playstyle. Combat in Hi-Fi Rush provides a very unique and engaging experience with some rough edges, which is to be expected, I guess. What I didn't expect though was the traversal side of gameplay being so competent. I had heard that the combat in Hi-Fi Rush was its main selling point, but nobody had mentioned that the level design and platforming was so enjoyable and full of unique mechanics. Between combat arenas in the game, you travel around these finite levels that are full of secrets and collectibles, alongside platforming challenges and the occasional mini rhythm game. There are 6 different areas in the game, all of which have slightly different structures and occasionally different theming, although most of them just fit into the category of futuristic building, because of course they do. Despite occasionally looking different, these areas do play mostly the same, having you take very linear paths to progress with a littering of secrets around that reward you with more gears or upgrade materials. These secrets are very abundant and occasionally quite well hidden. The game will often show you an upgrade material without the path to it being immediately clear, which sets you on this little side quest of figuring out the route to get it. They also did a very good job at placing useful items in areas that are a genuine detour to reach. There isn't dead space in the level where there's nothing to do. If you go exploring into a seemingly useless side room, for example, you will be rewarded with something for it. They also make really good use of the verticality of the levels when placing these secrets, as it's frequent that you'll randomly jump on a box or something and accidentally uncover a secret path that leads to a useful upgrade. And these upgrades are useful, by the way, like really useful, especially the main currency gears, because things get really expensive later in the game, in particular extra health and chip slots. Occasionally during these traversal sections, you'll be met with a roadblock that requires you to call in one of the other characters. This is one of the most underwhelming mechanics in the game for me, as it never gets more advanced than just calling them in and moving on. It seems like it would be a setup for a puzzle or something, but that puzzle never comes, and instead you're just left with something that is at best visually cool and at worst an annoying time waster, although Corsica's one gets a pass since it's a mini rhythm game embedded into it. Plus it's Corsica, it's Corsica. Mini rhythm games are actually used a lot within the traversal part of gameplay to break up longer sections of platforming. I'm not going to talk about them all because most of them are fairly self-explanatory, but the one I will talk about is zipline rhythm sections. These are quite possibly some of the best parts of the game, and they are very, very few and far between. To give a quick summary of the mechanic, Chai can use his grapple to attach to ziplines. Certain ziplines in the game have a mini rhythm game embedded into them where you have to dodge obstacles in the correct direction and kick enemies in time to the beat. These all feel amazing. They literally do not miss when they make one of these sections. They go so fucking hard, and they literally only have like 5 of them in the entire game. It's such an underutilized idea with so much potential. You could probably make an entire other rhythm game just based off this mechanic. It stands completely on its own 2 feet, and I love it, and I wish there was more of it. While exploring, you can also come across text logs and NPCs that you can talk to. Both of these have their fair share of problems, especially the text logs, which are best described as being out of touch. They just do not fit with the atmosphere of the game. When your core gameplay loop is all about moving to the pace of fast, exciting music, the last thing you want to do is sit your ass down and read half a book about how some guy hates his day job. I would call it tonal dissonance, but it's worse. It's like tonal whiplash, and it's the absolute worst way they could have handled optional lore. Ideally, instead of this, you would pick up audio logs that would play over the top of gameplay, but that's likely not a reasonable solution since the extra voice acting would be pretty costly and probably isn't doable with a budget of this size. The NPC side of things, however, is far better handled, with genuinely enjoyable dialogue that adds to the world building, something which Hi-Fi Rush desperately needs. There are even recurring NPCs like the detective, who's clearly a dev favorite character because he always has some long monologue to spew. There was one particular case though with an NPC that was odd. It had a side quest attached to it. In one of the earlier levels, there's an NPC who is bothered by pigeons making noise nearby. If you use Peppermint's ability to shoot at them and make them fly away, the NPC will reward you with an item. It was actually a really great moment where I stumbled across a free-form and unintrusive side quest that felt very natural within the game world. I never found another side quest like this in the entire game. They may be out there, but they must be really rare if they are, because I made a conscious effort to talk to like every NPC I came across. I sort of wish there was more of this in the game, but its scarceness is kind of one of the reasons it was so special. The platforming sections that come between all this exploration and uncovering of secrets is relatively standard. Chai has a double jump, his grapple, and the same dash from combat sections which he can use to traverse the environment. Most platforming challenges don't do much in the way of challenge, but I think that's alright for a game like this, since repeatedly retrying a really hard jump would be harmful to the pacing of the game. Fortunately, it appears that platforming, similarly to everything else in the game, was designed to be traversed on beat with the song, and the decision to have Chai retain his dash during the traversal sections was an excellent one, since it provides a faster movement option while simultaneously giving you a reason to stay on beat even when not in combat. Overall, the traversal and level design has a lot of flaws, but is still surprisingly well thought out for a game that's core focus lies in the combat. More rough edges rear their heads during these sections of gameplay, but most of them are optional and don't take away from your experience considerably. Throughout the game, I found myself taking the time to go out of my way searching for secrets, and that's exactly the sort of behavior good level design should encourage. If you're considering picking up this game, I highly recommend taking the time to master the combat mechanics and try out as many different combos and specials as you can afford, but I would probably steer clear of the text logs because they really aren't worth the effort, especially since you get so much more out of the main story that you ever will from them. Speaking of which, I think it's time for me to actually go through the story of the game. From this point on, there'll be massive spoilers, so go to the timestamp on screen if you don't want to be spoiled. As I said before, the setup for the plot is you, Chai, and your newly formed rebellion group consisting of a cat and a teenage girl have uncovered a project called Spectra, which you suspect to be evil in some way. So you set out to take down the higher-ups of Vandelay and prevent Spectra from being completed. After infiltrating the production department, you take out the first of the Vandelay higher-ups, Rekka, and when searching through her computer for information about Spectra, you swiftly find out that Spectra is a way for Vandelay to mind control anyone with their mechanical implants. Before really being able to process this information though, Chai hits a button on Rekka's desk, accidentally joining a video call with all the Vandelay bosses. It's here we're introduced to the main antagonists of the game and the dynamics between them. This is actually a really great moment in terms of writing, as it achieves a lot story-wise in a very short amount of time. It gives you a quick preview of each character's archetype and personality, foreshadows the connection between Kale, the main boss, and Peppermint, and establishes Corsica as being at the bottom of the hierarchy. While a lot of these characters may not be individually very strong, together they bounce off each other quite well. After Chai reveals a little too much about what they know, Peppermint shuts down the call and they head back to the hideout to figure out their next move. This is the first point in the game where we really get to see Chai and Peppermint's personalities clash, and it sets up the foundation for their relationship to develop throughout the game. Chai is the classic shonen protagonist archetype of thinking very little before acting and attempting to do everything in the flashiest way possible, whereas Peppermint is far more reserved and prefers to meticulously plan things out before taking any action. Not an unusual pairing in fiction, since the opposite nature of their approaches to everything is bound to create some level of conflict, and while these characters are very standard archetypes, they surprised me by being quite well written. Chai and Peppermint are both very flawed people, and they recognize those flaws. They are sympathetic and empathetic to each other, even when they do disagree, and because of that, they help one another grow as people over the course of the game. Chai becomes far more capable and reasonable due to Peppermint's influence, and while he still definitely retains his straightforward approach to things, his actions come across as far more thought out than they once did. A similar thing can be said for Peppermint. By the end of the game, she has far more confidence in herself and the people around her, and is willing to rely on their abilities rather than always attempting to think her way around a situation. Chai and Peppermint's interactions are the highlight of the narrative for me, because they are by far the most fleshed out characters and have growth that is very tangible and satisfying. It felt very similar to a character arc out of one of the Persona games, and that's some of the highest praise I can give a game. After a brief disagreement and a subtle threat from Peppermint, they decide to go after the boss of the research and development branch next. The boss of this area is Zanzo, and he's such a great character purely because he references JoJo like every time he's on screen. About halfway through Zanzo's lab, Chai runs into an enemy he can't overcome by just hitting it, so he takes a different approach and attempts to reason with it, which goes about as well as you'd expect. Fortunately though, after being knocked clean out, Chai is rescued by two new allies, Macaron and his robot companion, Cinnamon. Macaron is a disgruntled employee of Vandelay who lost his job to Zanzo when Kale took over as boss, and Cinnamon is just a robot, I guess. He doesn't do a whole lot apart from drawing his face. Macaron, however, does serve some purpose, as he can punch through those defenses Chai couldn't get through earlier. As a character though, he couldn't be more useless. He doesn't really develop or change throughout the game, and his dialogue is quite flavorless and benign. He feels more like a plot convenience than a fleshed out character, and honestly I feel that the game would have been better if he and Cinnamon never joined Chai and Peppermint, since their additions only take away time that could have been spent further fleshing out Chai's and Peppermint's character arcs. After heading back and defeating Zanzo by making him spend all of his yearly budget, which isn't a joke by by the way, that's actually what they did. The group are cornered by Kale and Corsica, and in an attempt to escape, Chai is captured. While Corsica is interrogating Chai, he informs her that the other bosses of Vandelay don't trust her and have restricted her access to Spectra files while also lying about its purpose. Corsica is taken aback by this information and leaves the room to go and investigate for herself. Meanwhile, Chai is able to escape from containment with help from the cat and goes after her. This begins what is probably the weakest level in the entire game. It just goes on for way too long. Every time you think it's over, there are like 4 more fights and another thing for you to do, and it starts off with one of those annoying video gamey go to place and do thing 3 times objectives, which are just so played out. If I wanted to do a repetitive checklist of tasks, I'd play at Assassin's Creed. It's not what I'm looking for in the rhythm action game that prides itself on fast pacing. A lot of this though is redeemed by Corsica as a character and her boss fight. Corsica is the only one of the Vandelay bosses that isn't enhanced by technology, so she's the only one that types in her password manually rather than just using a USB. This means simply beating her up like you did with the other bosses so far won't work, and she has to be reasoned with. This sets up her boss fight to be a really long one-on-one parry fight, where Chai never attacks and only parries while attempting to calm down Corsica and get her to join our side. I really like this boss fight and the dialogue that goes along with it. Corsica slowly coming to terms with the idea that the company she idolized her whole life isn't actually doing good for the world is presented through gameplay, as she progressively gets angrier and throws out longer and faster combos. It's a highly engaging sequence both narratively and gameplay wise, and it endears you to Corsica, who's about to become a member of your team. After you defeat Corsica and bang her head on a few doorways, Kale attempts to kill both her and Chai on the way back to the hideout. They manage to escape, but Corsica is seriously injured. Fortunately, Macaron and Peppermint have some experience with whatever counts as modern medicine in this world, and Corsica's life is saved through some sort of robotic implant. She's obviously extremely appreciative of them saving her life and agrees to join the group. Also, before we stop talking about Corsica, I just want to mention that her password that we worked so hard to figure out was just password. That's 3 bosses down and 3 to go, so next is Mimosa, the head of marketing. This stage is a complete 180 from the last, as it's arguably the best in the entire game. The visual design is unique, there's a lot of plot progression, and the music is so good. This is the first time we actually learn about what Vandelay does and where it comes from. I've actually been holding on to my main criticism of the plot until this part so I can talk about everything together. The main issue that the narrative of Hi-Fi Rush has is a lack of context. All of your actions and any events that take place in the game happen completely out of context, since you were given next to no information about how this world works, what the scale of Vandelay is, or even what Vandelay does. You go about the game chipping away at this mega corporation with no understanding of how significant your actions are. A very similar criticism can be leveled against our main character, Chai, who has so many questions surrounding him that are simply never answered. How did he break his arm? How did he get into the Armstrong project? Why does he want to be a rock star? Why does he even bother helping take down Vandelay? All of these go entirely unanswered. It's like they wrote Chai as a silent protagonist for the player to project themselves onto, but then decided to give him a personality anyway. The reason I bring this all up now is because a small portion of my criticism are addressed during this level, when we're given some brief lore dumps about the history and development of Vandelay. We find out that Vandelay was started by Roxanne Vandelay, who built robotics that helped solve a global energy crisis, which established Vandelay as the mega corporation we know today, and set the stage for their robotics to be integrated into every corner of life. We then get some great propaganda about Kale, which really sets Peppermint off, and gets her to finally talk about her connection with Kale and Vandelay. She tells us that she is Roxanne Vandelay's daughter, and therefore Kale's sister, and her mechanical leg was actually created by her mother when she lost her real one as a child. She then explains that she was driven to take down Kale because she doesn't believe her mother would have handed Vandelay over to him willingly, citing that he has a history of taking advantage of people. I think this moment in the story is meant to be deeply touching, but at least for me, it didn't have any effect. I think Chai's monologue in response was just too cheesy and generic, and the surprise reveal of Peppermint's connection was so obvious from the start that it just felt underwhelming. I don't hate this moment because it gives us more about Peppermint's character and motivations, but I think it could have been handled considerably better. After taking out Mimosa, we're on to Roquefort, which is a character and boss that I have very little to say about, which is probably because he's said very little. He hardly gets any screen time until he's the next boss up, and even then it's pretty limited. The most I can can say about him is he's a furry, which I didn't expect. A very similar thing can be said about this level. I just don't have a whole lot to say. Chai gets fired out of a cannon to get into Roqueford's building, which is fun and gave us this image, and Macaron does the one cool thing he will do in the entire game and punches the head off of a statue of Kale. Roqueford's boss fight has him turn into a big wolf, but mechanically it's pretty weak since you could just sit in a blind spot on his left arm. Oh, and during this boss fight I had my one glitch for the entire run where I just fell through the floor, which was kind of goofy. Overall, not a terrible level or section of the plot, just a forgettable one. Finally, everyone else has been taken out and we can challenge Kale. The team regroup for the final time and head up the elevator to Kale's office, where they're greeted by Roxanne Vanderlei, who traps them in a red box. The group quickly concludes the obvious. Roxanne is being controlled by Kale through the use of Spectra. Kale then enters and in the classic villain way, finally decides to explain his motivation behind doing all of this. He says, and this pains me to say by the way, that creating Spectra and repurposing the Armstrong project was all so that he could mind control people and force them to buy more Vanderlei products. What sort of fucking SAO bullshit is this, man? There's no way that that's what they had planned for this character. It's like they had the whole game made and written up to this point and then just made something up on the spot. It's such a weak reason, and they could have made it so many things. They could have dealt with serious themes, but no, me forced them to buy robot. For all of Kale's shortcomings as a character though, he does somewhat make up for it with his level and boss fight, which are probably the best in the entire game. This level is unique as it actually sees the whole team working together in person, rather than Chai just calling them in as some sort of hologram. This works exceptionally well as it reinforces through gameplay how much the team has grown and learned to rely on each other, with each member of the team helping Chai traverse the level. I especially like this section where Macaron basically builds the entire level for you as you go through it. This is also the level with the most zipline mini rhythm game sections, so, you know, I might be a little biased, but whatever. While this is all going on, you're being attacked by a massive robot, which is surprisingly taken out by Cinnamon, and in a stroke of genius by the developers, you actually get to play as Cinnamon during this level, which I thought was hilarious, especially since the only thing he can do is jump. After defeating the robot, you make your way up to the final showdown with Kale, where he immediately uses Spectra to mind control Chai, which sort of makes all of this seem absurd, since why couldn't he have just done that right from the start rather than all these extra steps? But then again, this is the guy that created a mind control AI to sell more RC cars. Either way, the game has one final trick up its sleeve, and this might actually be the best one yet. You get to play as the cat, and he's surprisingly capable. It's obviously ridiculous because this is the final boss and all he does is throw out super easy to dodge fire attacks, but I sort of don't even care because playing the game as the cat makes up for all of it. Once you scratch off his Spectra node, Chai is resurrected and the real boss fight begins. This fight is actually really good, both mechanically and visually. It's a proper test of all the mechanics that you've learned throughout the game, and forces you to make use of some of the more obscure parts of Chai's toolkit, like parrying in regular combat, for example. The only criticism that I have with this boss is that this phase, with the tentacle arms, forces you into a very boring playstyle. It has the same issue as the enemies with specific defenses. You're unable to attack Kale until the shields on his arms are destroyed. Now, this wouldn't be too bad if you could just call someone in to do that when Kale is just standing there, but these arms can only be hit when Kale does a specific attack where he gets them stuck in the ground. It slows the pace of the fight to a crawl, and it seems poorly thought out. Kale is finally taken out in one of the most satisfying sequences in the entire game, with Chai and each member of the team hitting him with consecutive wombo combos in time with the beat.
Happy feet, wombo combo. That ain't Falco. That ain't Falco.
After taking out Kale, the group reunites with Roxanne Vanderlei. She apologizes for putting them through all of this and offers everyone positions at the company with the intention of restoring it back to how it was in the glory days. The screen fades to black and we get an epilogue showing all the characters and what they're up to now. The game ends with our main group sitting on a cliff looking out over the sea, with Chai saying he's finally going to learn how to play the guitar. And that's Hi-Fi Rush. Overall, I think it's a very solid game that completely delivers on what it sets out to do. It manages to have a highly engaging core gameplay loop that stays interesting throughout the whole experience, likely due to its depth and capacity for player expression. Its narrative is certainly its weak point, but there's enough to enjoy about it that it remains a driving force to push through the game. Hi-Fi Rush is not the most well thought out at times and has a lot of rough edges, but it makes up for that with an enormous amount of charm and a lot of fresh ideas. It's a very innovative piece of work that came at a time where things are for the most part stagnant, at least at the higher end of game development, and it should be commended for that. It's definitely worth trying out, especially if you have Game Pass, or even if you don't. Thanks for watching.